Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good evening, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, the Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So to our subject for tonight, there's been a great deal of energetic discussion recently over the Marine Corps' adaptation concept for future conflict called Force Design 2030. In this special broadcast episode, we welcome two additional voices to this discussion. We have Colonels Tim Barrick and Matt Jones, both United States Marine Corps retired, who will look at some of the questions raised by Force Design 2030's vision, as well as go into some of their own contributions to that debate and pieces that they've published in the last couple of months. So first, we have Mr. Tim Barrick, who's currently the Wargaming Director for the Krulak Center here at Marine Corps University. He is the lead designer of the Marine Corps' operational wargame system. He retired as a colonel in 2021 from the Marine Corps after 29 years of service. His last tour on active duty was as director for the Wargaming Division at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. He also served as the commanding officer of the Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group out in 29 Palms as a colonel and 1st Tank Battalion as a lieutenant colonel. He is a graduate of the Marine Corps War College, the Naval War College, American Military University, and the U.S. Naval Academy. And he recently authored one of the items feeding into our discussion tonight, which was a piece at War on the Rocks called On Future Wars in the Marine Corps, Asking the Right Questions. Our other guest tonight is Colonel Matt Jones, who is also retired Marine Corps. He's a former infantry officer. His career crossed the fields, former infantry officer, but he also crossed the fields of both infantry and light armored reconnaissance during his time in uniform, with platoon and company command in 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, company command with 3rd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, MEU Battalion Landing Team XO for 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and battalion command of 3rd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. He also held command of the Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group and performed staff duty as G3 and Chief of Staff of 1 Marine Expeditionary Force. He's presently an independent consultant and a candidate for PhD in military history at the University of Leeds. And he recently wrote a piece in line with this discussion in the Marine Corps Gazette called Modernizing the Corps. So, gentlemen, good evening. Thank you both for your time tonight. I know I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion, and I know our audience is as well, as our numbers keep ticking up. So as we had sort of laid out the plan for this episode before the show, I'm going to do my best to kind of go through a timeline of the sort of going to when Force Design was sort of first became an item that the Marine Corps was looking at, and then go into some of the articles that have been written by members of the retired community who've raised some criticisms recently of some of the concepts in Force Design, and then as well highlight the articles that both of you gentlemen wrote, and then we'll go into those in more detail and open up the discussion between yourselves on some of these themes, and then get to our audience questions. So how did we get here? In some ways, it sort of depends on where you want to start, draw the starting line. But it has been mentioned in some of the discussions on this is before there was a Force Design 2030, you could arguably go back to when General Neller was Commandant, and he first, in one of his operating concepts, had sort of ringing the alarm bells that the Marine Corps was not trained, manned, equipped, or really in a good place to be ready for potential future conflict that it might face. And this sort of verbiage was reiterated when General Berger took over as Commandant. And he took over the summer 2019, and it quickly became apparent that there were going to be some big shifts in the Marine Corps under his guidance to try and get ready for that future conflict. He put out his Commandant's planning guidance, which it covered a whole host of topics, but the design, the structure, and the manning, the equipping, the training, that whole piece that General Neller kind of first laid out, he reiterated that and laid out a general vision for what that was going to look like. He had a number of different comments about, what he sort of saw as the main threat that was out there, how the Marine Corps stacked up with that threat, things that the Marine Corps needed to do to get ready for that, and some of them were different than the way we had organized, manned, trained, equipped, et cetera, in the past. In the process of that, we started getting some of the more detailed sort of force design concept papers, as well as updates, depending on the things that were laid out in those papers. For divestitures, changes in force structure. One of the more recent ones was a much more detailed guidance plan for talent management. And in fact, just today there was a response article from one of the retired generals on that talent management piece. And then throughout this, there was a sort of a combined campaign from the Commandant and Headquarters Marine Corps to lay out to different audiences like what this was going to look like, why the Marine Corps was doing it, and where it was trying to go. And that took the many different forms, from appearances before Congress to General Berger publishing his own articles in notably some non-Marine Corps places like War on the Rocks, Naval Institute proceedings. I believe there's even one in an Army publication. A lot of podcasts in some of those similar different audiences. But a definite a campaign to explain what this was and what's going on. And then in the last couple months, we've started to see some kind of a more cohesive response from former senior leaders inside the Marine Corps, raising some questions about, why we were doing this, what some of the potential shortfalls were, and this has sort of taken, as we were saying before, sort of accelerated really in the last couple months. And again, trying to find a start line, it's a little bit difficult. And I know, in the Gazette and some other places like War on the Rocks as well, other folks who were not former GOs were raising some questions and writing some stuff back and forth. But I think what really caught my attention, and I think everyone else's, our guests here, attention, is going back to early March, when we started seeing from some very senior, both former Marine general officers and other leaders in the Marine Corps, pieces talking about this. So early March, we first had two pieces by Bing West, who's done a ton of writing, ton of coverage about the Marine Corps, in Iraq and Afghanistan. But he was also a Marine himself, and his time goes way, way back to, before I was born. Mid-March, we had a piece, first piece by Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper. And then shortly after that, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Jim Webb, former Secretary of the Navy and former Marine. Beginning of April, we had John Schmidt enter the chat. And John Schmidt, for those in the audience not aware, his name is not always well known, but he had a fairly sizable role in that. He was the author of First Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, Warfighting, which was then revised into MCD, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting. But that was the doctrine when maneuver warfare, which became the warfighting philosophy of the United States Marine Corps. And first one came out in 1989, and that has been our philosophy of conflict since 1989. So some of the questions that John Schmidt was raising was, this way forward is not matching the philosophy for how we say we're gonna fight and operate. And then last 3 days, there's been in Task of Purpose a series coming out from some names like General Van Riper, who had already contributed, but we also had a piece by Lieutenant General Anthony Zinni, as well as a piece today by Lieutenant General Gregory Newbold, specifically on the force design. So that's kind of the trend for what got us here. But like I said, there have been other voices who've been trying to both look at force design and see, are there some things in there that need to be looked at a little more closely to make sure that this is to the benefit of the Marine Corps down the road. As well as also looking at some of these critiques and noting that there may be pieces there that some of the critiques are missing. So that brings us to the articles that you gentlemen wrote. Like I said, we had Colonel Barrick. You had a piece recently in the War on the Rocks that kind of looked at several different questions in terms of sort of from both the proponent side and some of the critic side of what were some of the questions and characterizations. Were they accurate? Were they fair? In some cases, if they were, Marine Corps, what's your answer to that? Because those are some fair questions. And then Colonel Jones, for yourself, your piece was sort of a more direct response to General Van Riper's specific op-ed that came out as well. So I think I caught us up to where we are today. And so, and I'd like now to take the time to start turning over to you gentlemen, if you could, for the benefit of the audience, kind of maybe summarize each of your respective pieces, what you were trying to get at in those, and then we'll go into kind of a larger discussion on some of the other issues that both you addressed and the retired officers have addressed as well. So on my agenda, Colonel Jones, I've got you going first. So if you want to lead off and tell us what you wrote, why you wrote it, and what you were trying to accomplish with it.
Yeah, happy to. This piece, modernizing the core, it's a real short little thing, 1,500 words, appeared in the online section of the Gazette last month sometime. And it was a response, as you mentioned, to the specific piece that General Van Riper had in Marine Corps Times, which was itself a very short piece. I would say the piece that I responded to, I don't think it does justice to General Van Riper's full argument. That's actually one of the points I try to make in this article. Nonetheless, the thing in the Marine Corps Times was just such a caricature of the opposition position that I felt I had to respond. And before I do, I'd also just add one more item to the list of list of things you've mentioned. There is a piece in the long-running maneuverist papers series that appears in the Gazette, in the most recent Gazette, over under the pseudonym Marinus, whoever that is, that basically makes an expanded version of the article or the argument that General Van Riper made in that Marine Corps Times piece. It's worth reading. And my response to it with a little more detail would be very similar to what I'm about to say here. So anyway, General Van Riper in the Times basically made two arguments. One is I end up characterizing as a straw man argument, basically saying that the Marine Corps has transformed itself specifically for this scenario of fighting the Chinese in the South China Sea, sea denial in the South China Sea. We've transformed ourselves 100% for that mission, and of course, at a cost in our broader ability to perform the full range of missions that are still legally ours in the rest of the world. That to me is just a gross caricature of what Force Design 2030 does. It is indeed a straw man contention. It's just absolutely not true. And in the article, I just quickly make a couple of points, right? But probably the most obvious and salient of which is we would not have retained 21 infantry battalions and a air wing bigger than the air forces of most countries in the world if it was our intention to purely do sea denial in the South China Sea, right? So that one, honestly, and I know we'll talk about it more. There are more nuanced versions of that argument that are made, and they have some merit. But as it appeared in that particular critique, I thought it was a caricature argument and a literal, straw man. The much more important argument that General Van Riper makes, which is also made by pretty much all the rest of the critics, though, is that even if we are not 100% committed to fighting the Chinese, we've picked our preferred threat and reorganized for that. Even if that's not the case, we have made changes that are likely to have a real serious effect on how we prosecute combined arms warfare in the 21st century. There's a lot of focus on the tanks, and I know Tim, actually both Tim and I, as former armor officers of one kind or another, the tank has been pretty close to our hearts in the past. So the tank has garnered a lot of attention. Cannon artillery is another element, right? But those aren't the only changes that affect the way that that we clearly intend to prosecute combined arms warfare across the full range of threats and employment scenarios in the future. And I think the real argument, that deserves considerable respect, far more than the South China Sea straw man, the argument that deserves serious respect is, have we gone too far? Have we made changes that really do compromise our ability to be relevant in a wide variety of employment scenarios, from crisis response through forcible entry through potentially land operations following the forcible entry. So, the second part of my article tried to give that argument some of the respect that I think it's due. And I'll conclude there. That's basically all it was. 1,500 words, two big points. Not much more to it. But it's in that second category that I really think the discussion the interesting discussion lies.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. And then Colonel Barrick, over to you. You can give us a snapshot of what you were trying to get after in your War on the Rocks piece.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks for hosting this tonight. So, what got me, putting pen to paper, so to speak, was the Jim Webb article and a specific line in there where he said, all based on a computer war game in Quantico. And since I was the war game guy during this time frame, I felt a certain sense of responsibility to help kind of clarify what it was based on, and then also some of the process critique. And I do think that this is going to be an interesting case study in history that is going to go back and look at this from the amount of organizational change that the Commandant has set out to try to achieve. There's certainly, I think, a lot of things that he has done really well. And I think there's clearly some things that could be improved upon. This situation that we're in right now is clearly not something anybody wanted to have happen, with the Marine Corps getting critiques publicly in the way it is. And was that avoidable? So I in an article first, I set out to talk about the process and at least get some of the story straight in terms of what the process was. And I think a key point in there was that, this was something that was started years ago and built to a point under General Neller, where it was pretty clear that the Corps needed to change. And some of you may recall an article by Leo Spader in War on the Rocks in spring of 2019, that was essentially an open letter to the Commandant, asking, who am I? Who are we as a Corps, right? And I think to a degree, we're still wrestling with that question. And I mean, the Commandant has been very clear about it, but there's a lot of folks that are still not embracing the direction that the Commandant has laid out for the Marine Corps. And I think the Commandant, when he stepped in, he wanted to provide some of that clarity. And the ground dinner speech by General Neller, I believe it was in April of 2019, he very clearly laid out that change needed to happen. And I think rightfully so, he put it on his successor to make those changes, because whoever was Commandant needed to own that going forth, and he knew that he was heading out. So I think that he made that right call, but because he waited on those decisions, it was really coming to a head in the force development realm. It was recognized that the national defense strategy that had been laid out, if the Marine Corps was going to comply with the direction and do to meet the needs of a fight in the Western Pacific, that the Marine Corps was not organized, trained, and equipped in a way that was relevant to that fight. And if that fight was the priority, then we needed to make some changes. And that was kind of a known state of play as the Commandant stepped in. So, I talk about the process. I'll just kind of, for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of jump through that. He handed off a vision to the enterprise in Quantico in early October of 2019. And then since then, from a process standpoint, that force design enterprise has been in motion in a whole series of planning efforts, experiments, war games. I think the process that at least some of these retired generals would like to see happen has been happening. And I'll tell you, I actually get pretty frustrated when folks, lay it all on wargaming because, and think that wargaming is driving everything. Because what I would tell you is I actually experienced frustration because we weren't driving things. We had recommendations coming out of war games that were recommending some changes, and the institution has been slow to act on those, and rightfully so, because once the Commandant put a stake in the ground, and said, okay, here is the aim point. Now he's asked the enterprise to kind of help paint the way, but he's looking for better clarity on the changes than just an output from a war game, especially if that war game was a bunch of people just coming together and talking about things. And so that set a high standard for, the war game process, how we were conducting the war games, and then a recognition by all that a campaign of learning was hard. And when I say that, wargaming, experimentation, analysis, that all of those things needed to feed into change decisions. And therefore, we've seen not a lot of change from like the basic design of the MLR, the Marine Littoral Regiment, since summer of 2019, even though some changes are arguably warranted in the concept and vision. But, if you're going to run form a unit and then get it going and the Commandant recognized that time was limited and he had to get things going and do that. And now there's going to be adjust fire missions on the force design. And I think it's important to convey to everybody that the force design is not in a solid state right now. I mean, it is going to continue to evolve. It's probably going to continue to evolve every year as more is known about what may be needed and how we need to evolve. And so it's not locked in stone. And there's a lot of things that are still being refined and experimented on with decisions still pending. And we'll see an annual update come out here sometime in the near future that will probably have some new items in it that are changes to the force design. All right, so that was process. Then I got into roles and missions, talking about stand-in force concept and the role of the mission in the rest of the world. And we're going to talk a lot about that. So I'm going to save most of my commentary on that for a few minutes. And then the last thing I got into was combined arms and talking about the concerns over the retired generals regarding the cuts to the tanks, the artillery, and what that means for combined arms, and really pose some questions about. There are some very real hard questions about what is the future of ground combat. And we're seeing that unfold in Ukraine right now. And there's things that we're seeing that are part of the legacy of combined arms with artillery and infantry and tanks all being employed. But we're also seeing a lot of new stuff and a lot of vulnerabilities of some of those legacy capabilities. That's not to say that they're irrelevant. And there's a lot of arguments to be made that armor absolutely has a place. And I can talk a lot about that. But I will save that because I really want to get to some of the meat of the conversation here as we head to kind of our core topic that we wanted to hit. Ian, would you like to kick that off, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure. So, and as I was, we do have a sort of a framework here, but I know there's a couple of common themes in both of your commentaries here. So maybe we'll kind of lead off with that, because it does sort of get us to some of the things we want to go into deeper. So, you both sort of mentioned the identity of the Marine Corps, and a lot of the GO responses said we were potentially losing some fundamental part of our identity. And you also both mentioned the concerns about the loss of combined arms. And so I guess maybe we start off with, as our identity as a Marine Corps, like what are sort of your thoughts about what is that tied into? And as I'm thinking about sort of our maneuver warfare background, right? It was never technology dependent, right? And that was something that was pretty clear in our warfighting philosophy. However, the philosophy also does talk about concepts like, combined arms specifically. And some of the concerns are that we are potentially losing our ability to do that. And that is noted as something in our warfighting philosophy. So, I guess from your perspectives, what are we as a Marine Corps? What do we need to provide in the future, right? And the changes in some of the divestments in terms of our combined arms capability, which is looked at as a core capability. What is your sense of the potential threat or challenge to our ability to do that? Or do we need to have a more broad concept of combined arms? Is it tied to a specific piece of firepower, an artillery tube or a mobile weapons platform? If any of that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things wrapped up in there, Ian, and what you're saying. This question of identity and what defines us. And I would just observe in passing, this is an ancient question for the Marine Corps, right? We wrestle with this continually. During my career, I worked for both Commandant Neller and Commandant Berger when each of them was the director of ops as a brigadier general. And that question was on the agenda in 2004 and again in 2010-11. what is it that we do, right? What is it we advertise we do? And there's been a range of many options to choose from throughout our history. Are we the small wars force? Are we the amphibious force? What is our role when the nation is, in sustained war and conducting sustained land operations? All the way back to World War I, we've always stepped up and played our part in those operations when they take place. And of course, again, in our careers and the whole war on terror experience, we did our part. So, but what is our basic identity is one, and then this other one, you mentioned, kind of woven into that is, I think maybe more the subject of what we're talking about tonight is how do we do combined arms, and clearly that changes, right? At the Battle of Bladensburg, we did combined arms differently than we did, in the Pacific in 1944. And although our basic doctrine rightly places the man over the machine, we've been masters at integrating machines at every stage, right? There's a whole raft of brand new technology that we integrated into a new combined arms system during the Second World War. I mean, that's what we do, right? So the notion that somehow, we are independent of technology, it's obviously false, right? Based on our history. So I think, my suggestion is maybe we talk more about combined arms and, about identity, but up to you, Tim.
Yeah, I think Matt, this gets to the question. I think it is related to both identity and combined arms. I think there's a number of bumper stickers the Marine Corps had in the past that the generals are particularly concerned about, and I think, frankly, there's a lot of Marines that are concerned about. So, I'm a supporter of the design in terms of the Western Pacific, but there are some very fair questions about, okay, how does that design get applied elsewhere in the world, and what is the applicability of the Marine Corps in other contexts? So America, or Marine Corps is a 911 force. In the past, it's been described as a middleweight force. I think the Commandant is clearly, leaning in the light direction in terms of the characterization of the force. But is the Marine Corps still relevant? Taking General Van Riper's title to his article that came out, I think it was yesterday, that we're marching to irrelevancy. Is the Marine Corps relevant in conflicts outside of the Western Pacific? If we've been using the Western Pacific as a benchmark, and we have over the last few years, per the Commandant's direction, that has been the benchmark. That has been the focus of most of the wargaming scenarios, and the concepts are looking at that kind of framework. So, Matt, I would pose you the question, what do you think about the force design's relevancy to other scenarios, other missions? Can the Marine Corps still go any climb or place, any mission the president directs?
Yeah, fair question. And that is, in my article, my response to General Van Riper, that is the area that I think there's, as you said, that's where the real extremely valid part of the critique lies. So I think that, General Berger has, I think these articles have gotten less attention than some, but he's put out a couple articles that get at that. And, Ian mentioned them earlier, right? The case for change back in 2020, and then the 2021 article in the Military Review, Preparing for the Future. Both of those make the point that, yes, and I would also just say, right, I have to put this on the table. We got some very specific direction in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, National Military Strategy, that hasn't yet changed to my knowledge. I'm not deep in what's going on in the Biden administration on that level, but as far as I know, that guidance still stands, and it told the Marine Corps to do some very specific things in the Western Pacific, and that guidance was not optional. I think, and the Commandant has made that point in both of those articles that I just mentioned. The changes in the force, for the pacing threat in the Western Pacific, some of that's directed guidance, and then doing it is not optional. So I think, that said, the changes that Force Design 2030 brings, which part of them involve, for example, greater organic firepower in the infantry battalion, organic precision firepower, really, air-delivered firepower in a sense, right? Loitering munitions, UAS, this kind of thing, organic to the infantry battalion on a, vastly greater scale than anything we've had before. There's that. The reductions in cannon artillery have been balanced, I would argue, by increases in rocket artillery with the capability to deliver both precision rounds today and whatever the future of multiple munition ordinances in the future as that develops, right? These capabilities are meant to offer longer range precision capability organic to the ground combat element, and then there's certain trade-offs that had to be made to create the structure, free up the fiscal resources for that. Part of that, of course, obviously is for the specific directed missions in the Western Pacific is the ability to shoot a certain number of anti-ship missiles. And there's a whole big debate that Tim probably knows way more than I do about exactly how that works and where and when that happens, right? But I guess to your question, the increase in organic firepower in the infantry battalion and the addition of massively greater long-range precision fires organic to the GCE. I mean, this is kind of what the GCE has been asking for decades, right? The 5th generation GCE, to match the 5th generation ACE, if you remember that whole debate back in the, a decade or so again, right? The ACE that ate the Marine Corps. This is, what the GCE has been asking for a while. And is it relevant elsewhere? Well, yes, because a lot of it is much more deliverable, ship to shore by largely aviation means that are accessible to us against the long range precision threat that we would face in, for example, any forcible entry scenario. We can actually get serious capability ashore by air, which was not the case when you're dealing with very short range dumb ordnance that was largely all the Marine Corps infantry battalion could deploy. In its pre F-Force Design 2030 design. So I would argue that that capability is potentially relevant in any number of scenarios, from crisis response through forcible entry. Now, and I'll just cut it there, right? My answer to your question is it is absolutely relevant, with major reservations about how well it all works, right? Which is, that's the subject of debate right now that I think is valid.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that the mu is still, in essence, the ARG mu. It is we see this with the shipbuilding effort plan that just got published from the Navy, that the 3-ship ARG mu is still essentially an intact concept, but arguably it is more capable in many respects from the aviation to include the GCE. And just to note, part of the force design from an artillery standpoint, there's enough artillery that each mu is going to be, there's going to be an option there of being able to deploy with either M777 or with rockets or missiles. Of course, there's a number of details there that need to be worked out if we go the rocket missile route. But for an ARG mu to be employed, there's a far more robust sensing fires capability. And this gets to a key point that we haven't talked about yet, which is some of the why behind change, which goes to the maritime precision strike regime and the threat to amphibious operations. So when we talk about the other activities of the Marine Corps, one of the things that's talked about a lot is, joint forcible entry and crisis response. And from a crisis response standpoint, I think that there's a fair argument that the capability there is easily as robust, and you could argue more robust in the potential of what a mu brings to the fight. But the challenge is going to be getting it ashore in the threat environment with the anti-ship threats, the anti-air threats. What we don't want to have happen is what happened to the Russians in Hostomel, right? Where they're delivering an air assault force, and then it gets essentially hammered on entry and extract, and also on the ground. And that's what we're trying to. That's the challenge of the operating environment, right? Is how do we effectively employ forces in a power projection mode into these threat environments that are essentially their own kill webs, right? That are available not just to China, but to any country. And so, Matt, as we talk about that, and what is your thought relative to, the joint forcible entry And does the Marine Corps, going back to identity, combined arms capability, to what degree are we still able to do those things? Do we even need to be able to do those things? Is the commandant articulating that we do those things? What do you think his message is on that?
Yeah, well, I think, and going back to identity, right? One of the pieces, that the not only the retired community who's been vocal in opposition recently, but others who have been, that I've heard say things that, a little bit more privately, have made the point that, part of our identity we can never give up, and I 100% agree with this, is this, really statutorily mandated role as the nation's, globally employable naval expeditionary force in readiness, right? Ready for crisis response through whatever, right? What the Commandant has done, I think, though, and I'm going back to the two articles I mentioned, as well as to the Commandant's planning guidance. I mean, he's drawn a pretty bright line between the ability to do crisis response up to forcible entry, to open the door for joint force follow-on, and the conduct of sustained land operations. In the Case for Change article, he made the point that the pre-2019 force was heavily optimized for a vision of forcible entry. I'll come back to that. And then literally for sustained land operations, right? And that's something that, I see some of the names that are on the screen here, right, have been involved in this debate on the side that, we were way too heavily optimized in the war on terror period, for sustained operations ashore, of a particular kind, right? But even before that, we had bought a lot of gear that was heavy, hard to get from ship to shore. The MTVR, with all due respect to tankers that I love, right? The M1A1 tank, right? These are big, heavy beasts, right? That require some serious effort to get from ship to shore. And so to the question of, can we do forcible entry? I just think it's a little bit, I'm not sure what the right adjective to use, right? It's a little bit questionable to presume that the force that existed prior to 2019 was realistically able to conduct forcible entry operations, leading to sustained ops ashore within the mature precision strike regime. This was General Berger's point in the Commandant's planning guidance when he said, we can obviously no longer line up, 30 amphibs, 9 nautical miles offshore and shuttle the stuff through the, ship to shore, right? Our effort to solve that problem was OMFTS back in the 90s, and it didn't work. We didn't get the gear that we thought was necessary, all of the gear, to do that. We got portions of it, which radically, I would argue, increased our ability to do air assault operations. But the AAAV, the EFV, that didn't pan out. So that, what were we left with? What is the real vision for doing ship to shore with the pre-2019 force actually doing forcible entry? I would argue the burden of proof is on the the resistors to explain how that can be done. And by the resistors, I mean those who are commenting recently. That's a little bit of a loaded term, right? Those who've been commenting recently in opposition to force design 2030. The onus is on them to explain how that can realistically be done. 2 MEB JFIO, old style, that's an obvious non-starter. Anywhere we would really have to do it where we couldn't just land unopposed to a port, right?
I would just say that I think that the onus is also on the institution here to convey the vision of how that is conducted in the future, right? I mean, and when you go and this is one of the critiques that I had in the article of stand-in forces. If you do a word search of stand-in forces, you're going to find sea denials in there 32 times, defense is in there like 24 times, and deterrence is in there about 22 times. Offense is listed once.
Yeah.
Season is listed, I think, twice. And in both those cases, it's like associated with an example, not like the content of the vision specifically says it's a defense in depth vision. And even me coming out of the warfighting lab, as I digested stand-in forces, I was left questioning, okay, are we doing anything else? Or is this really it, right? Is this the force defining concept that defines who we are, what we do, and we don't do anything else? And the Commandant has been making statements about we are a reconnaissance force, counter reconnaissance force. And I can understand, even, coming out of, working force design for 2.5 years, and then now stepping away from it for a while, and now reading these documents, I was left wondering, okay, are we really not doing anything else? This is who we are. We're just counter reconnaissance and reconnaissance. That is our defining capability. And what about when the nation needs us? I would make a point. There's, we're starting to click the clock away here. I just want to convey, the Army is 485,000 in strength. The Marine Corps is 172,000. When you do the math, we are 35% the size of the Army. So we're like 1/3 of the force. Now imagine if you're a battalion commander and one of your company says, hey, I'm going to do reconnaissance, counter reconnaissance. You guys go do your thing. I've got this, right? And I don't need to worry about anything else. I don't think that's what the commandant is saying, but even me is asking the question, right? And so, what defines how we're going to fight in the future when it's not the first island chain, right? When it's
that's a very fair question. And I know Ian wants to move us toward Q&A, and I do too. So I'll just real briefly. First, I'd be the last to defend, the communication strategy. I think what you said has happened, and you're right to say the onus does lie on, I think on the commandant, frankly, and the institution as a whole to explain. But I do think also, like any given concept coming out of Quantico, right? In this case, stand-in forces, EABO, Loki. I don't think it's ever been the case in Marine Corps history that a given concept, defined everything that the Marine Corps was going to do, right? I don't think that was the case for the original tentative manual for landing force operations back in the 30s, right? That didn't define everything the Marine Corps was going to do. Like the Marine Corps still went into, Haiti and whatnot, in a roughly contemporaneous time frame and did small wars, right? So, but nonetheless, right, there's a missing piece. There's a general missing piece about, how do we no-kidding fight, on the ground with combined arms, wherever that turns out to be the case. And I do 100% agree with you. That has been a missing element coming out of the force design and combat development, bureaucracy. And that hole needs to be filled. And I'll just offer one thought on where I think, like you mentioned, recon, counter recon. And, if you take from that, and, there was a lot in that article that was about the maritime context, right? But one point that was also in that article, where the commandant specifically tries to anticipate, push back, and answer it, he says, he thinks that is applicable to warfare in general, right? Like the argument, right? I mean, to be debated and proven, I would argue, but the argument is that reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance is vastly more important in any warfighting environment now. Because of the prevalence of the precision strike regime. You can be seen and killed, right, by everybody from, ISIS with a crappy drone carrying a grenade, to the Russians or the Chinese with advanced capabilities coming out of industrialized societies, right? This is just the reality. And, to do that, the hider finder contest, the shoot first contest, these are all a little bit more meaningful than they were. They've always been meaningful, but the stakes are higher now because the amount of firepower that can come upon you with a detection by ubiquitous sensors is just of a different order of magnitude. So maybe, arguably, this changes how we do combined arms.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with it all on the importance of reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance, and particularly in today's fight with precision munitions, that you need to be doing counter reconnaissance in order to protect the force, and you've got to do reconnaissance in order to strike and shape. But this gets to, I think, the core of the combined arms debate, which does the Marine Corps need to still close with and destroy the enemy? And if it does, and I would contend that America expects its Marine Corps to be able to locate, close with, and destroy the enemy, then can this new set of combined arms capabilities deliver a force that can close with and destroy the enemy, particularly in various types of training? I think, having been the guy that was wargaming force design, I will be the first to admit that we have given inadequate attention to that. There have been war games that have looked at the infantry battalion in other contexts. They just ran one over this last year with a Baltics context to it, and so it has been employed, but particularly in a defensive framework. So I think there's a very fair question here about the force design, and the combined arms set of capabilities that are needed in today's environment. How do you overcome the threat of loitering munitions and drones to be able to get your force to maneuver, right? You have to open and control the air, that air fight, which our multi-billion-dollar ace is not contributing enough to in that first 1,000 feet, right? And whose job is it? Is it the GCEs to do it, or is it the ace to control that first 1,000 feet? Who needs to craft the set of capabilities, the tactics to do that? Is it the infantry battalion, or is it the ace that's going to go in there and shape that to make sure that the GCE can maneuver? These are core questions that we need to define and essentially control that space to enable the ground force to maneuver. This is combined arms. And when you counter that, then your ability to maneuver your tanks and et cetera that you need to go in and, close with and destroy infantry that are, entrenched, that are in buildings in urban terrain. You need high explosives to go in there and blast them out, generally speaking. There's a theory that precision is going to help you go in there and we will see. We'll see how that plays out in wars. I see we may have some questions coming in.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with you 100%, Tim. That is the question, and I don't rule out anything that was a part of the the quote legacy force. I'd be the last to argue that we know any of that from tanks to tube artillery is no longer relevant. Period. Right. I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that there are risks that the pre-2019 force didn't manage adequately. Right, and some of the changes we're making are going in the right direction to counter that. But they raise a whole bunch of new questions, and I just think it's that is really what we have to figure out. And I personally don't believe we're devoting enough effort to doing that at present. But that's just me.
Yeah, and I think that gets to that is the challenge. Like, where does the Corps go from here, right? The focus on solving the Western Pacific, the China pacing threat problem that has consumed the preponderance of the force design effort, and I think rightfully so. And I would say that our concepts of how we would contribute to that joint campaign are fairly mature. And as we look to go forward, though, because particularly from the communications narrative, we've been so hard over in this direction on China's the pacing threat that we've got to put more attention. The Corps needs to put more attention on its applicability. We can't just say it, right? We just can't just say, yeah, we're applicable, we're still doing the other things. We've got to show and demonstrate through more discussion and attention and focus on how do we contribute to crisis response? How do we contribute to other contingencies?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I keep saying just one more thing, but I would also think that there's a lot going on out at 29 Palms that I think is highly relevant to this. It's been my privilege over the last couple of years to be involved in different roles with the MWX, the force on force exercise that goes on down there, out there now, been going on since 2019. There's a lot of learning going on out there about generally how do we fight in just a ground scenario out in the desert, right? How does this stuff work out there? And I feel that that's actually not getting the attention it deserves in the sense of being integrated into combat development as a source of actually, potential knowledge about how that works. But it has not been, a maritime scenario. It has not been anything related to the South China Sea for most iterations out there. It's just Marines slugging it out force on force with increasing presence of the kind of capabilities that Force Design 2030 offers. And there's some game-changing things that happen out there when those capabilities enter the battle space.
Well, and I think you bring up something that highlights process. Obviously, process can always be improved, but I think this is something that I think some of the retired generals don't fully appreciate or understand is the experimentation effort that has gone into the infantry battalion with 3 different infantry battalion efforts in the Fleet Marine Force. This is not just a Quantico thing being dreamed up, that you've got the FMF out there doing live experimentation, providing feedback on different configurations, on the arms room concept, on different aspects of the infantry battalion, that is coming back to Quantico. And there are still decisions pending on what that infantry battalion looks like. So, these numbers that get bantered about, the question of size, and this goes back to what we've been talking about. I would contend it's less about how many infantrymen you have in an infantry battalion than what are the set of combined arms capabilities that the infantry have available to them to employ at the tactical edge, and how is the Corps setting them up for success at the tactical edge. And it's not about what the size of the infantry battalion is. It's that the whole force effort. And as I see Travis Reese has put in there, this cross-domain, multi-domain effort, getting synergy at the tactical edge across all these domains. How do you achieve that? And that is, I think, where the force design is heading. And I think it's going the right direction, but we've got to put more emphasis on, the range of scenarios. And I know you beat me up constantly the last few years trying to get at some of these other scenarios. And this just gets to a question of capacity and wargaming. And that's something where Marine Corps University, we're going to be trying over the next couple of years to contribute more from a wargaming standpoint to this discussion by being able to take some of these questions and explore them, at least in an unclassified realm, some of these combined arms questions.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think, given the limitations on resourcing and the combat development enterprise writ large, I think the university has a huge role to play there. We can leverage a population of very knowledgeable current folks to work through some of these things. Again, as you say, at the unclass level, but Marine Corps schools from the beginning was a contributor to change and everything we've done historically, and it still should be. So.
Yeah, I want to comment on Travis Reese's comment there about joint force operating scenario. There's a larger discussion to be had on not just the Marine Corps, but the whole joint force enterprise and how we are defining scenarios and building those scenarios that shape the future force. Some of you may not know that there used to be defense planning scenarios that were the basis of future force development. And it was a number of years back that the DoD cut that, and they stopped making those, and they put on the services, hey, services, you go figure it out, what defines your capability set. And then it was a few years ago that everybody started to realize that maybe it wasn't such a good idea. And the joint force operating scenarios came back in to be the scenarios that we would war game against and do analysis against to design the future force. But the joint staff had lost the capability to build and make those scenarios. So it was actually a few years ago, the Marine Corps raised its hand and said, all right, we will take lead on building the first joint force operating scenario. And everybody else in the other services contributed to that planning effort. And that became the joint force operating scenario that we ended up wargaming against. And then other services now are started to pick up and contribute more, but to some degree that the joint force process was broken there for a couple of years and is now trying to get back up to speed.
Yeah. That's a whole separate category of discussion. Some of the arguments against force design are predicated on, we won't be able to do X. That is for example, a war plan requirement, or a requirement ultimately stemming from this defense research work that happens in what used to be the DPS, now the JFAS. To me, that's a circular argument, and the people that are making it know it's circular. I mean, we define what our job is in the JFAS, for example, right? The services write into those things, the things that they think they need to be able to do, right? So they are by no means an independent yardstick for how the character of war is changing, right? They're a bureaucratic product. But I guess set that to the side. There's an interesting question that Major Oda raised about allies and partners, and I think it's a great one. And the only thing I know on this is just from something I read. I think it was last year. I mean, in the press, the commandant clearly goes around and tries to explain this to some of our allies and partners, right? The thing I'm thinking of, recorded an engagement with the Japanese ground self-defense force, or actually probably a level up, the Japanese self-defense force leadership, where the commandant went out there and briefed them, frankly, on force design 2030 and what it meant for our operations in Westpac. So I don't know the details. It's a great question, but there's clearly an effort being made to communicate to them how they play in it.
Yeah, I can shed a little light on that. So we have done wargaming with the Japanese and with our Five Eye allies on aspects of force design. One of the challenges that we had was that joint force operating scenario that I talked about was secret and it was not releasable. And that was a problem that was identified, and it went all the way up to OSD to kind of reframe some of those to be able to be releasable. That was the intent, and they were trying to get that direction. And I don't know where they stand today, but it was definitely something we tried to do. And in general, what you have to do to make that happen is you have to ensure all your scenario products for the game are at the classification level of those that you bring in. And we struggled with that because most of the ones that we got handed to say, here's your scenario, were not. And so that was a recognized deficiency, and there's been a concerted effort to fix that. And where we could, we would go bilateral or with Five Eye. And there's been a number of those war games that have been conducted, and also by the invitation of those countries that they've invited the Marine Corps to participate in war games with them hosting as well. So it is occurring. I think it is definitely something that more needs to be done. But that is the core challenge, is the classification piece.
All right. Thank you both, gentlemen. And as we're looking for some more questions in the discussion, really there in sort of the last 5-10 minutes and looking at the, what else are we going to have to get looked at to do? There's been all this focus on the South China Sea. The process of this, it reminded me a lot of, sort of the similar problem set historically in like the 70s and 80s, where, I'm from, before my time uniform, right? But I've done some studying about what we were doing back then. And, the focus was the Soviet Union, right? Like the focus is the Soviet Union, tanks going through the Fulda Gap, and then the Marine Corps was looking at the northern flank of NATO. That was what if maybe you could call that the northern flank, was sort of our South China Sea. But what did we end up doing? We did Grenada, we did Panama, and then we did Desert Storm. None of which were the thing that we were pointing out as the big main threat, the most destructive possible thing. But we were, what we were doing in the background to get ready for that, it seemed to work effectively in those crisis response situations that were not at all what was, what the main thing was thought to be in that time frame. So I guess maybe as to turn that into a question as a jumping off point, do you think we're sort of in a similar situation right now where we've been maybe hyper focused a little bit on one place, but the things that we're doing it's still a tailorable MAGTF that we're going to put together based on the threat if it's a crisis response, if it's on the South China Sea. Like, I guess going to the where do we go from here? Do you think we're still going to be able to execute that? Because we're not throwing the MAGTF in the garbage, right? We're not throwing the tailor all the elements based on the threat concept. That's not going in the garbage. So do you think we should maybe have some more confidence, or maybe the commandant could talk a little bit more confidently about being ready to do those things?
Again, I'd be the last to defend the communication effort, but I already mentioned earlier, I do think a lot of what is changing in Force Design 2030 is relevant, needing testing, right? And further development, but relevant to the full range of challenges, right? But I do think the analogy to the 1970s and 80s isn't a bad one, right? I mean, one thing that the Marine Corps, like LAR, for example, came into the Marine Corps not because of the northern flank, right, but specifically because of the Quick Reaction Force, what became CENTCOM. What do we do with these big, massive military, mechanized forces in the Middle East, right? In the hands of Iraq and all the rest of these, these players in there. And how do we get something ashore, that can actually fight, right? That's where maneuver warfare came from. It wasn't fighting the, Russians in the Fulda Gap primarily. It was fighting, second, third tier nations, that were using their doctrine with heavy mech elsewhere. And how did we handle that, right? That the record in the Gazette is pretty clear about, the discussion that led up to that. The northern flank, arguably was how we justified still having amphibious capabilities. But that's again, historical debate on that. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, I think there's potential relevance. Again, when you see people like the Houthis, fielding elements of the precision strike regime, they're able to deliver, anti-ship and anti-ground, anti-air fires at a so far limited but increasingly effective level. When guys like that are playing, we have to change the way we operate even to deal with the lower tier threats.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on this question from Travis Horde, where he speaks to General Zenni's concern, which those of you who may not be tracking some of the conversation that's been coming from General Zenni is his concerns about componency. And to sum up his concerns, it's with the emphasis on naval integration and with the Marine Corps aligning itself with the Navy, which there's a lot of argument for doing that. But that, there has absolutely been a narrative by the Marine Corps, and I think this goes back to, there's a marketing issue here, I believe, where we've given the Heisman to the land component, and there's a reluctance to align ourselves as part of a land component because we did that for 20 plus years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this goes to the not doing a sustained land campaign effort, which again I contend that as a force that is 35% the size of the Army, the nation cannot afford us to walk away from land campaigns. And so this gets to General Zenni's concern about componency. And one of it is that the Marine Corps over the years built a relationship with the combatant commands where if they needed a force, you had the MEF that you could reach into and task organize a force and deliver it for whatever contingency. Hey, we're here. The message from the Marine Corps to combatant commands was, if you need something, ask and we'll package it and send it, right? That was kind of the marketing campaign of the Marine Corps, is we're the force in readiness and we'll respond. Well, some of that narrative has been changing, and there's been a alignment of the Marine Corps with the Navy and with the maritime fight and with the Pacific that has been messaged that is reducing its contribution to other combatant commands. I would tell you, I think we can do more. In doing some war games on this, there is plenty of capacity still in continental United States. So you have the forward force deployed, and then you've got forces in the United States there's a lot of capacity there. And when you add it up, if we could generate a MEF forward. Now, the challenge is on what timeline? How do you get it there? This goes to what is the pre-positioning plan for the Marine Corps? Can we offer a Marine Expeditionary Brigade, a Marine Expeditionary Force as a component headquarters, working with the combatant commands? What is on the menu, right? What is on the menu when it comes to the Marine Corps and combatant commands that they can ask for? Is it, hey, we'll only come if we're part of the GIFMIC? Or if they need a MEB, but it's going to be part of a land campaign, is the Marine Corps going to offer it up? And I think that's one of the core questions here. I believe, and I've looked at the numbers, I've done the math on the order of battle, we have the capacity to generate a MEF. And I think that we will improve that capacity over the years. Now, again, this goes back to, and this goes to wargaming, this goes to some of the realities and challenges of today's environment, is can you get it there in time? But the argument that General Zenni will make is the Marine Corps historically has been the first to get there. The only ones that compete with us is the 82nd Airborne. And they obviously can get out the door pretty quick. But otherwise, if you want a force with any kind of punch, you go to the Marine Corps. We're the only ones that can get it there the fastest and give you a balanced, very capable force. And that is, I think, what General Zenni is arguing. I would argue the same thing. And I believe that the capacity and the capability is there. But this goes back to the combined arms question of, have we, removed capabilities that limit what that force can do? But I think this goes back to the competency of the Marines and the set of capabilities that is being put into an infantry battalion is not talked about enough. with the loitering munition capability, the electromagnetic spectrum operations teams, with signals intelligence, electronic warfare. I mean, all those things, the unmanned, the drones, all of that stuff is coming. And that is going to dramatically improve the combined arms capability set that a battalion delivers to the fight. And when you aggregate 9 battalions with, regimental headquarters over the top of them, and then you bring in precision fires with, a couple battalions of rockets, and you can still bring in a battalion of M777, maybe even 2 when you add in the reserve capabilities. And we'll see where they go with the active component. There may be changes coming up in the force design in terms of the overall numbers of batteries and realigning some of that balance.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I agree with you fundamentally. I think there's plenty of capability there, and I think the argument, with all, I won't say all due respect, I'll say the greatest respect to the gentlemen that are making the counter arguments. I mean, the fundamental presumption that they have is that we cannot be relevant unless we contribute in more or less precisely the same way that we've been doing for the last 50 years, right? With a sort of mini, slightly faster deployable version of a Army, combined arms ground force, right? That's what we evolved into by 2018, with a bunch of very heavy, strategically relatively immobile systems, right? That required a bunch of accommodation, in the form of things like MPF, which of course required ports and, airfields and all the rest of it, right? That was our argument as of 2018 about how we got all that stuff there. And all that stuff, again, when you even give, you respect the capability that the Houthis have today, right? That stuff becomes highly problematic. So I would argue that, absolutely, in 21 infantry battalions, the giant ace, all the stuff I mentioned in the, my brief response to General Van Riper, there is ample capability in the tool set to meet combatant commanders' requirements. And it is frankly disingenuous to pretend that the only way that we could meet those requirements is by doing just what we did, 2018 and previously. That to me is actually the fundamental denial of the reality of war, that we hear a lot about from the opposition side. It's a denial of the fact that the face of war changes, as not only technology, but society change. And that's happening. And again, I don't pretend Force Design 2030 is perfect, right? But it's moving in directions that we were not moving, before it came on scene.
So Travis's question, for those who may just be listening, is any thoughts on how the Army has placed the 18th Airborne Corps along with 5th Corps currently in Europe? Does that intermediate staff capacity at scale supplement the Marine Corps as the crisis response force under Goldwater Nichols? Matt, you want to take that one?
So we're talking about in Europe, right? Again, going back to the comment earlier about the northern flank, right? We've had great difficulty over the course of our history trying to craft a narrative to how we're relevant in Europe. And I would just argue that most of the time, throughout our history, we've been most effective when we don't pretend that we're strongly relevant in Europe, right? That's a theater that is built for the United States Army and the United States Air Force, with exceptions, niche cases still on the northern flank, right? But yeah, I mean, my argument, and this is just Matt Jones, purely my personal opinion, but yeah, let them have it, right? Let them worry about the threat that has the GDP that's half that of California, right? And we'll worry about the one that's going to be, bigger than ours in a couple of years, if it's not already.
Yeah, Travis, your point about the Army using Corps headquarters to request forces outside of GFN. Well, I think what's going on right now is a special case, right? And you've got a situation where you got National Command Authority that is directing traffic and making things happen. Could the Marine Corps, could you take a MEF headquarters and end up putting forces somewhere or putting Marines in there? And we do have Marines over there as part of that. But, at the headquarters level, the MEF is still a warfighting MEF headquarters at the 3-star level. And it is arguably, from a joint warfighting standpoint, it is arguably, the most capable. And I know the Army would take issue with that, but it is still has the reputation of being a central node in a warfight. And I would argue even more so in the future with some of the capabilities coming in, our MEF headquarters are going to be even more capable. And this goes back to the all the effort over the last 5 years. I mean, keep in mind, I mean, when was the first MEF headquarters group or MEF information group stood up? I mean, it was only like 4 or 5 years ago. And that represents 2017, thank you, a significant enhancement to the warfighting capability at the MEF level across domains has been improved. And it is a much more capable headquarters than what it was 20, 30 years ago. And I think that it's still relevant. And I would argue that the role of the MEFs in the warfight in the Pacific is absolutely critical. And they are able to be applied anywhere in the world and be just as capable, if not more so, absolutely more so than they were in the past. So I think the argument that we don't have a MEF that can fight anymore is just completely not coming to grips with the reality of the improvements that have been done, the modernization effort, and the emphasis on all domain warfare, and the reality of the current battlefield, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, when 3MEF has done and is doing that in the Pacific, in exercises today, 1MEF is postured to do it globally, right? 2MEF I'm less familiar with, so I won't speak to them. But the notion that, the fact that the Army has taken this initiative in Europe somehow supplants us as a globally relevant, ability to form a core headquarters equivalent and operate globally. It doesn't compute to me. I think more power to them. In Europe, that's their traditional stomping ground, and they should continue to do that.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen, both for that and for hitting all those questions there, and for to Travis Reese out there and Lieutenant Colonel Travis Ward. Thank you very much for your inputs. So I don't see any other questions popped up in the chat, and we are running up on about over 70 minutes here. So I want to take a final chance for you gentlemen to have any final comments, and maybe we can frame it in that question of sort of where does this discussion go from here?
So let me throw in a couple comments here. Just I got 2 points I want to round off with, which is trying to set the record straight again on some of the force design, because there's a lot of misperception about what the force is. And one of the comments that frankly kind of bothers me a bit because it's just inaccurate is this comment about missileers, that the Marine Corps is now just a bunch of missileers, and that's all we're doing. Well, first off, when you look at the size of the force that is actually doing that mission, and the number of batteries that we're talking about, especially the number of batteries that are forward, it from a percent size of the force, it's like ridiculously small, and it's just a small portion of what the Marine Corps is doing. And to characterize the whole force as this missileer force, it's not a realistic argument, and it just doesn't have the legs under it. With respect to missileers and the requirement of delivering those capabilities, there is a very fair argument that those ground missile batteries that we are putting out there are going to deliver a significant capability to the joint force that dramatically enhance the combined arms toolkit that a MAGTF puts in the fight, and delivering not just anti-ship capability, but beyond that, as we go to the future, that's a capability that can evolve and do other things, and that is something that, as we look at the composition, this gets to the question of the infantry battalion. So some of the concern about the force design and about why this missileer label gets put out there is when the infantry battalion gets tasked as this littoral combat team, that they're perceived as just being the security element here for the missiles. And there's some concerns about that. And I think there's arguments, there's other ways to look at how this force is employed. This gets to the concepts of employment, and it also gets to the force generation dynamic. And in the experimentation effort, as we go forward, as the Marine Corps goes forward and looks at this, how does that evolve from an infantry battalion? And the loitering munition capability, again, I go back to, I just want to beat the drum on the infantry battalion, because that's been taking a beating and it's been said to be, marching to irrelevancy. You're going to have at the company level the ability to strike, from 25 kilometers to 40 kilometers plus, and to sense and strike. I mean, think about that. What that does for the capability for crisis response from the sensing, the SIGINT, the electronic warfare, and the ability to strike, and to do it with a relatively light capability that you can get from ship to shore relatively easily, and it's mobile. You know, that's been the problem with M777s. And how do you get the fire's capability ashore? And this future infantry battalion is going to have a set of incredible capabilities to sense and to strike, which when you are a small force, let's face it, that force coming ashore is going to be small. You have to be able to sense and strike and to be able to do the mission. And it's going to have a phenomenal capability. So there's more to it than the arguments that have been put out there.
Yeah, and there's a question from Ryan Sawyer, mentioning that it appears that FT-2030 is centered around a Taiwan scenario. I think that relates to kind of what you were just talking about. I mean, FT-2030 was really, it's not designed for a 2030 a Taiwan scenario. If anything, the caricature argument is that it was designed for a South China Sea, scenario where we're hopping around from all these little islands to, assist the Navy in sea denial. And that is absolutely what the MLR is supposed to be doing, in 3MEF, in that scenario. But that's not the driver of the entire force. And I refer you back to the Case for Change article, which, was kind of a long, dense piece, but I think some of the retired folks would do well to read it again, because it makes arguments, based on, one, the mature precision strike regime, two, gray zone threats, which is a little bit, dropped off our radar now that, Russia has jumped out of the gray zone, into the, whatever you call the no kidding, full on get after it mode. Right. But, but that's nonetheless still out there, right? China is still doing that stuff daily, out in the, throughout their sphere of interest. So, and then the final piece was just the, given the, the threats that really matter most to the United States right now, the increased salience of the maritime domain. And these were all drivers, not, a given part of the, part of the Westpac geography, right? The Med is part of it, anywhere where there's a littoral interface is part of the driver for Force Design 2030, which, oh, by the way, is not a novel thing for the Marine Corps, right? We've been talking about the, the littorals for decades. It is our bread and butter locale as the global naval expeditionary force in readiness, arguably. The counter argument is this: we need to be ready for sustained land operations. And the Commandant, again, in these, his public statements, has been pretty clear on that. We'll do our part when the balloon goes up, but we're not going to build the force for sustained land operations. That's the Army's job.
I think I do have one more comment, and this is kind of piling on what Travis threw in the chat here about the dissenting opinions are missing a modern ability on the landward side of the fleet to contribute to conditions of sea denial, sea control. And I think what is missing in the counter arguments to force design that are being put forth by the retired generals is, okay, if you are the component commander to Indo-PACOM, what are you offering that combatant commander that is relevant to the fight? You want to talk about marching to irrelevancy? If we did not change, the Marine Corps would be irrelevant to the Pacific fight, period. And so from a componency standpoint, from a force offering to Indo-PACOM, what is the Marine Corps offering the combatant commander that is relevant to the problem that he is trying to solve? And that is what the Commandant is doing, is he's delivering a capability that does that. And the challenge now as we go forward in force design is to examine the relevancy of that force to everything else that goes on in the world. And I think what we're going to find is that it is very relevant and very capable. However, it may have some gaps, and those gaps may need to be fixed. And that is something that I think the learning organization and the enterprise of force development is continuing to look at. But that is an important question that we've got to put more due diligence on.
Yeah. Travis Horde and Cannon Cargyle, great to see you on here, by the way, Gunner. I think put their finger on a real issue. The LCT in an MLR is completely different from a unit OPCON to a division, a Victor unit. That's a fair point, right? Like, the MLR contains a sort of a bog standard, 20, 30 infantry battalion as its LCT with augmentation of other capabilities. Does that make sense? That's still a great question, right? And I will say, dovetailing off of one of Tim's earlier comments, I don't think the composition and operating concept behind the MLR is fixed in stone at this point, right? There's experimentation efforts going on in multiple places on that, notably in 3MEF, and I have to think that that's going to evolve as they learn, with greater accuracy what it is they actually need to do that mission. I bet it won't be exactly the same kind of unit as a Victor unit. And I think our historically proven ability to task organize, combined arms teams out of the toolkit that we have is likely to prove really valuable in that context.
All right, thank you. And I think those are both excellent notes there to end on. So unless you gentlemen have any save rounds, we'll be ready to do, I think, call it a night. And yeah, this has been great. I'm definitely grateful to both of you for doing a kind of a late show on the Brewcast here. But I think it was incredibly valuable, and I'm personally very excited to get this one up and get it out there and have it contribute to this discussion as well, to bring, kind of round out some of the things that have been brought up previously in these articles we were talking about. To our audience, thank you as well for coming here for a somewhat later discussion. And we hope you all have a good night, but we'd also make sure that you want to follow us for future episodes on both this subject and other upcoming ones here that we're going to schedule. For those who maybe it didn't come clear, but we had pages more of things we could have gone over tonight. So we may consider doing a sort of a mini series of these focused on this and the way that we've been doing the down the rabbit hole on the Russia-Ukraine war, looking at Russia. So not signing you gentlemen up for any homework right away, but there's definitely more here to talk about. The retired community has raised multiple articles worth of concerns. I can see multiple sessions here to go after, some of those things in greater detail, but we'll see how that goes here in the coming weeks. But the things
in the unlikely event somebody wants to hear more from us,
I'm expecting this one to get a lot of views and a lot of listens. So I think we'll find a demand signal for that, sir. For the ones that we do have coming up though, for our audience, just so you're aware, right now we're working on the time, but tentatively scheduled next Friday, we're going to get back to our focus on the war in Ukraine with Dr. Joanna Sikiera of the University of Bergen in Norway. She's coming in to talk about something that we've been trying to actually get after for a while in terms of themes and just haven't had a chance to, but looking at the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law in the context of that invasion. Obviously, with a lot of the horror stories coming out of a lot of the cities that have been retaken or the cities that are still under siege, finding ways to hold those people who've done those things accountable is going to be, something that a lot of people are going to want. But as our guest is going to talk about, it's also a pretty big challenge in terms of what prosecuting international humanitarian law can and cannot do. So she's going to get into that for us. We also have some of our new partners at the Swedish Defense University working on to cover some additional perspectives on Ukraine from their angle. And then also want to make sure we get a plug for the next Middle East Studies Research Talk, which is coming on Thursday, May 5th. And that is, it's Middle East Studies, but we're actually still talking about an aspect of Ukraine. That's going to be Thursday, May 5th with Dr. David Mallet of American University, talking about what to expect when you're a foreign fighter in Ukraine. So please keep following us on all our social media channels to stay up to date to make sure you catch all of those things. And all right, again, finally, gentlemen, and to our audience, good night, and thank you very much. And I look forward to getting this one up.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.